Great. All right. So thanks everyone for coming on a lousy night and braving the weather. I know most of you here, if any of you here are new, my name's Chris Silber. It's up there on the board. And I'm, aside from just a frequent attendee of these GGLR, Libertarian Party, Bay Area Conservatives function, in my spare time, outside my normal job, I write bi-monthly columns for Cautious Optimism, which is it's a pretty small current events page on Facebook. And my archives, I'm not here to push the archives, but push the archive of these presentations are on my blog site. And by the way, for those of you who were here last time, my site has changed. So I'm now putting my talks and my articles on cautiouseconomics.com. And there's nothing cautious about the website. It's just called that because it's easier for the Cautious Optimism readers to remember the name. I am not a formally trained economist, but hopefully you'll get something interesting out of this talk. The title is a little long-winded, but in a nutshell, what it means is I'm going to part ways this time with a lot of people in the libertarian or the sound money movement and talk about why I think hyperinflation is not inevitable. We've been hearing about quite a bit of it for the last decade. And I'm going to address specifically the three items that we tend to hear the most about discussed that we think are going to drive hyperinflation in the near future, which is quantitative easing, QE, the national debt, and the possible end of the dollar as the global reserve currency. Real quick housekeeping item. Last time we did this, it was pretty informal in terms of people raising their hands, and I think that actually worked out pretty well. So I'll pause for Q&A after each of the three sections, about QE, global reserve, national debt, and at the end. But if I'm in the middle of something, sometimes I kind of gloss over with acronyms. And if you're not sure you understand an important or key concept, just go ahead and raise your hand and ask. Yep, Dan?
With the lights?
Yeah, actually, that's the question for everyone else. I'm fine with it, but how does everyone else feel about the lights? Can you see the screen okay, or would it be?
With the lights on?
Would it be better
With
with
the
the lights?
lights off up here.
Well, the lights off.
Yeah, looks better.
What's them on tomorrow?
Oh, there's one more disclaimer. As usual, I've done like 4 or 5 of these talks now. As usual, it's the first time I've talked about this material. I'm not like demanded all over San Francisco to talk about libertarian economic issues. So, so these slides, I just put them together in the last month or so, and I don't have everyone memorized. So occasionally I might hit one, and just forgive me if I have to pause and gather my thoughts about. Oh yeah, I remember. Okay, what this slide was for. But we'll see how smoothly it goes. All right, so let's get back on my presentation. Alrighty, so as I mentioned before, these are the 3 topics I want to discuss, QE1, QE2, 3. I changed the order a little bit. I'm starting with the easiest ones to debunk, and I'm working my way up to the hardest one. The national debt is really the toughest one because there's so many variables going forward. And before I get into those 3 specific topics, I want to start with this talk about imminent collapse. So some of the terms I've heard thrown around the last decade are hyperinflation or Weimar Republic. I've heard run on the dollar. I don't know if any of you have ever heard this before, or collapse of the dollar or imminent collapse. So I want to define these before I attempt to debunk them. I want to try to set out and establish a definition. When we hear imminent collapse, in general, we hear people making predictions of hyperinflation, and we've probably heard these references before, right? Zimbabwe and the Weimar Republic, and then more recently we've been hearing Venezuela. So, we're heading towards Venezuela type hyperinflation. If you look up the definition of hyperinflation, there's no official definition, but there's a fairly good consensus in the economics community that once prices start rising by 50% per month or greater, at that point they tend to agree you're in a hyperinflationary environment. Well, if you get out a calculator and compound 50% growth and raise it to the 12th power to account for 12 months, you get an inflation rate of 13,000%, which means prices are rising 130-fold every year. So I'm actually setting a pretty low bar for myself here to say, okay, I don't think prices are going to rise 130-fold, but I'll give it a little wiggle room. If someone comes out and says, well, what if prices rise 100-fold in a year or 50-fold in a year? Look, I won't hold them to the definition. I'll say, yeah, that's really bad. I'll call that a collapse of the dollar. Okay, but that's the official definition. And then part of the other definition of imminent collapse is there will be a rejection across the globe of using the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, and then all the dollars will come back to the United States, and we won't know what to do with them, and we'll have a hyperinflation here in the U.S. Okay. Sometimes it goes even beyond that. We start hearing predictions of the disintegration of civilization as we know it. I've got a friend who's into this. He's kind of a prepper type. And he keeps warning me, if you guys ever seen Mad Max, The Road Warrior with Mel Gibson, yeah, he talks about that a lot, how the U.S. is going to be like the Road Warrior. And well, here you go. See, here's an example of a prepper basement. Okay, so I'm very, very skeptical that these things are going to happen. Definitely extremely skeptical they're going to happen in the near or midterm, like in the next 5 or 10 years, and even skeptical going out 20, 30 years. Although that's so far out, it's really kind of hard to make predictions. Here are some examples of imminent collapse talk. Anybody in the room here know Peter Schiff? Yeah. Okay. I personally kind of like Peter Schiff, and he was dead on right about the housing bubble and the financial crisis. And he wasn't just broken clock right. I mean, he said specifically what the mechanism was going to be, and it turned out exactly as he said it would be. But once the Fed started to respond to the crisis with quantitative easing, ever since then, the last decade, he's been one of the loudest. I don't know, what would you call it, Cassandras out there warning us of imminent collapse and hyperinflation. So here's a couple of quotes. I won't go through them word for word, but as you can see here, he's saying, we're marching down the road to hyperinflation. We're pursuing the very policies that every other nation has pursued and eventually had hyperinflation. I'm telling you to prepare for a dollar collapse. I don't know exactly what's going to come, but I can see it coming and know the only way to prepare is prepare as soon as possible. So these quotes were made in 2009, 2012. I think I saw a YouTube of him just like in 2017 or 2018 where he was still telling people to put everything they had in gold and silver and still saying there's going to be a hyperinflation, but he was kind of backing off a little on his rhetoric, but he's still sticking to it. Zero Hedge, anyone read Zero Hedge? Okay, I do from time to time. I enjoyed their articles. I enjoyed their comments. But they've been a big proponent of, not proponent, I should say. They've been very big on warning about hyperinflation. So here we have an article called "The Time to Prepare the time to prepare for hyperinflation is before it explodes." This is back in 2011, and they're saying all the similarities between the U.S. today and the Weimar Republic pre-hyperinflation are striking. What was their reasoning behind this? The U.S. Federal Reserve, like Germany's financial elites, believes that currency depreciation is a good thing. We are engaging in disastrous policies similar to those employed by the men who brought hyperinflation to Western Germany. And then here's several quotes from basically gold and silver sellers. Obviously, it's in their interest to sell you gold or silver, to tell you that warn you of hyperinflation, although I personally think they believe it. I think most of them aren't deliberately lying or making up a fiction, but it happens to align with their interests. So here we've got the collapse is coming. That was just last year. Why the dollar collapse is inevitable. That was last year. Collapse of the dollar and hyperinflation is just a breath away. Now, that was 4 years ago, so that's a pretty long breath. Hasn't happened yet. Okay, so my thesis is that these continuous predictions have not materialized, that the mechanisms that are restraining inflationary pressures are actually not that hard to understand, but they're generally not very well known to the public. So hopefully in this talk, maybe I can communicate some of these mechanisms. And again, I hope you find these interesting. And then this is a big one I want to push, and this is more political. So these frightening drum beats and constant talk about hyperinflation and imminent collapse, I think it actually harms the sound money, free market movement or end the Fed movement. And I think most people in this room share my dislike of the Federal Reserve. Some of you probably know I would be happy if all the central banks of the world went away. And I do believe in sound money. But I think when you become the boy who cried wolf, and year after year after year for over a decade you warn of hyperinflation and it doesn't happen, I think people notice that. They hear it and they start thinking, hey, 10 years ago you were saying it was going to happen in a couple of years and it hasn't happened yet, so how much can I believe you? And sadly, some of the more left-leaning people out there, figures like, anyone know Paul Krugman, the New York Times economist? Paul Krugman, he drives me crazy and he's wrong about so many things, but he's capitalized on this. So he wrote a column, I can't remember what year it was. Okay, it was just last year. Basically mocking the hyperinflation doomsayers. And he said, remember, this was written a year ago, so he's talking about something that happened a decade ago. And he's saying, immediately following the 2008 crisis was a golden age of inflation derp, and he's making fun of Glenn Beck and Ron Paul, frothing at the mouth Austrian types. Okay, that might describe me. I generally am an adherent of Austrian economics, although I don't think hyperinflation is coming just around the corner. And he's saying, if you're an economist, you predicted runaway inflation, As far as I can tell, none of them has even gotten to step A, which is acknowledging their mistake. That's not entirely true. I know, like one, for example, Robert Murphy of the Mises Institute, he did come out a year or two later and he said, yeah, I was wrong. And I think he figured out what I'm gonna talk about in just a moment here. And that they kept saying that the wrong thing year after year, which is what makes it derp. So his readers are getting this ammunition to use against the sound money movement, and it does hurt. I'll just say us collectively somewhat. Okay, so what are the precise arguments in terms of QE, the global reserve, and the national debt? When it comes to QE, it is true that the Federal Reserve inflated the monetary base. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, we're going to see a chart of it in just a second. Okay, and it's true that the Weimar Republic also inflated the monetary base, and that the argument is that therefore we're going to suffer the same inflation that Weimar Germany did. The global reserve argument is that other countries are going to unseat the U.S. dollar as the incumbent global reserve currency, with our help, by the way. For example, the QE. There was a brief loss of confidence in the U.S. dollar in the 08-09 period, and that the repatriation of all those dollar reserves coming back to the United States are going to trigger a Zimbabwe-like hyperinflation. And then the third argument is that the national debt, and this is already old, I just heard last week that it hit 22 trillion. It's no longer 21 trillion. It can never be paid back, and in order to pay it back in nominal terms, the government's going to have to resort to hyperinflation, or if anything, even just to service the interest payments, the same way Argentina did or Venezuela is doing right now. Okay, so let's start with the first of these, QE1, QE2, QE3. Anyone ever seen this chart before? Okay, yeah, a couple of nodding heads. This chart, I took this, and you're going to see a lot of charts in this section from FRED. This is the Federal Reserve Electronic Database, I think is what it stands for, and it's maintained by the St. Louis Fed. I hate to compliment the Fed because I'm pretty anti-Fed, but the St. Louis Fed site is really good. Okay, they keep really good data on interest rates, on monetary aggregates, on the monetary base. So if you ever want to go back and find, I've found statistics from the Great Depression and used them from the FRED site, and I don't think they fudge the numbers. I think the numbers are pretty accurate. So this chart has been used quite a bit by people who are predicting doom and gloom. And this is the monetary base. The monetary base is not the same as the money supply. It's what economists refer to as high-powered money. They're the reserves that banks, commercial banks, hold that they in turn can lend out simultaneously at the same time as other people can claim them on their demand deposit accounts. And through a complicated process that I don't really have time to explain, although if you want to know more, ask me in the question period, called fractional reserve banking, the monetary base can multiply into a much larger money supply aggregate known as M1. That's basically the sum of all of our checking account deposit balances plus currency circulating in the public. And then that, in turn, through the same process, can multiply into an even larger aggregate called M2, which includes things like savings deposits, time deposits, certificates of deposit, and so forth. But the monetary base, this really alarmed a lot of people. I mean, I have to admit, it kind of alarmed me. I didn't fully understand what was going on, but when I saw this, I mean, this goes back to 1984, but if you were to go all the way back to the founding of the Federal Reserve, you'll notice that the line is pretty flat with a very gradual increase over a century, and then suddenly in 2008 it goes straight up. And according to my math here, in a single year, the monetary base over doubled. It went up 103%. So a lot of people saw this and they thought, well, it only goes to show that prices are probably going to double and we're going to have a hyperinflation. As you can see, this gold selling website did the same thing. They went back to 1940, and it's true. They said a monetary base that took almost a century to create has more than doubled post-2008. If we go forward from 2008 to 2012, that includes QE1 and QE2, and I think that might even be QE. I think that does include QE3. The monetary base, if my math is right, over tripled in a period of about 3.5 years. And the climax of the QE was a year or two after QE3. Now here it's really easy to see, right? There's 1, there's 2, and there's 3, at which point the monetary base had grown to $4.16 trillion. So at this point it is almost quintupled in 6.5 years. Now, it is true that there is a correlation between the monetary base and the larger monetary aggregates. So here I've got the monetary base from 1984 to 2008, And down here I've got M2, which is the largest aggregate that the Fed at least still keeps track of during the same period. And as you can see, they're not identical, but it's not like one of them is spiking asymptotically, right, while the other is growing gradually. So in general, the overall money supply tends to grow, roughly in line with the monetary base. Again, this was the 2008 thinking. People thought, well, the money supply tends to do what the base does. So if it goes up, if the base goes up fivefold, the money supply is going to go up fivefold as well. But now we have a problem. What happens when we compare post-financial crisis the monetary base to the overall money supply, or at least to M2? As I mentioned earlier, in 6.5 years, the base increased by 377%, but the larger aggregate of M2 only went up by 53%. So there's a huge disconnect. Obviously, we've seen this when we go to the grocery store. We did not see a fivefold increase in prices on the shelves of the grocery store in 6.5 years. We saw something much more modest. 53% is, on a compound basis, 6.7% per year. And if you're wondering why we haven't had 6.7% inflation per year, it's because, number one, the economy's had some growth of its own, which absorbs there's more goods and services. And number two, when we get into Section 2, some of the dollars that the Fed prints end up going overseas and held by central banks as a global reserve. So the Fed can always print at a faster rate than the actual inflation rate that we observe when we go shopping. Okay, so the disconnect. Why did the monetary base go straight up, but the money supply did not? And here, I know you've been waiting with bated breath. Okay, here is your answer. All right, it's a little bit complicated. Okay. So the first thing we have to do is we have to divvy up what are the components of the monetary base. I mentioned earlier it's bank reserves plus cash in circulation. So this chart removes the cash and it looks at just the reserves. Well, there are two kinds of reserves. There's reserves that are required by commercial banks to hold to back their demand deposit balances. Some of you may have heard that banks can create 10 times as much money as they actually have in the vaults. You ever heard that term before? Okay, that 10% they have to hold in a reserve, that's a required reserve. And it's for those of you who went to my gold standard discussion late last year, it's actually not even 10%. You guys remember, it's something like 9.3%, because banks actually don't have to hold any reserve. It's a 0% requirement up to like $16 million, and up to $200 million it's only 2%, and then anything after that they have to hold 10%. So if you're a mega bank like JP Morgan and you have billions in reserves, your ratio is going to be not 10, it's going to be like 9.9. But if you're a small bank, it could be, you could only be holding 5% in reserve or 6% in reserve. So these are the required reserves down here in red. This is what they're required to hold. And then anything banks choose to hold in excess of their required reserves are called excess reserves, appropriately enough. And that's this dark blue line. And you'll notice in the 8 years prior to the financial crisis, the banks weren't too keen on holding a lot of excess reserves. They preferred instead to lend their reserves out to try to maximize their profits. You notice there's a little bump right here, 9/11. That's the Fed, quote unquote, flooding the system with liquidity in case people want to pull money out more rapidly from the banking system. As a fallout from the terrorist attack. But of course that's nothing compared to what we're going to come up against here during the financial crisis. Okay, so the Fed flooded the commercial banks with so many dollars in new reserves that it easily eclipsed their required reserve requirements, and their excess reserves went stratospheric. Now, if the banks opt to lend those excess reserves out, then yes, you're going to have a major inflation, because as soon as they lend it out, it enters the economy, somebody receives the money they deposited at their commercial bank, now that commercial bank has reserves, it lends some fraction of that out, and then new money is being created and so forth. But clearly, for some reason, the excess reserves didn't enter the real economy. And I put a note down here, it says to prevent inflation, we have to prevent, not we, but the Fed, has to prevent aggressive lending of excess reserves. So the way it did it, and that it was Ben Bernanke and the whole FOMC and all the governors of the Fed, they knew exactly what they were doing. They implemented a policy called interest on excess reserves. It's a pretty boring name, but it's extremely important. It's actually become, I don't know if anyone's read this, it's become their primary policy tool, very quietly. Okay, so IOER, you're going to hear me refer to the IOER rate, or the interest on excess reserve rate, quite a bit here. Now, this idea of paying interest to banks on excess reserves began initially as just a theoretical paper introduced by, of all people, Milton Friedman, okay, the 1960s. Okay, and the idea, I'll admit, I have not gone out and looked for his paper and read it. I probably should, because I would be interested to know what the rationale was. But just my general reading of IOER policy is that Friedman argued that it was compensation for the quote-unquote opportunity cost of commercial banks holding required reserves because their international counterparts, particularly in Europe, banks in Europe aren't required to hold 10% reserves. Like I know in Germany, I think they're only required to hold 3 or 4%. And I have an official confirmation. I was on vacation in Europe and I asked a guy who worked for a bank for what that's worth. Okay, but it is true. Our banks have to hold 10% reserve. In Europe, their reserve requirements are much lower. Therefore, if they lend out that extra 6% or 7%, they can earn interest on that money, whereas our banks, the money just sits there and earns nothing. So Friedman suggested, maybe the Fed should compensate the commercial banks for these reserves they have to hold on to. It kind of remained in the realm of academia until 2006. Now, in 2006, the Financial Services Regulatory Relief Act included a provision that the Federal Reserve is authorized to begin paying interest on both required IORR and excess IOER reserves. But I'm just going to say, for the sake of argument, I'm going to say no one knew the crisis was coming. We know Peter Schiff knew it was coming and Ron Paul, but I don't think many people in Congress or at the Fed, definitely at the Fed, knew that the crisis was coming in 2.5 years. So it's kind of a coincidence that they were authorized to pay this interest. And in fact, as further proof it was a coincidence, the law stated that the Fed wasn't authorized to start making interest payments until 2011. So 2 years later, the crisis occurs. Anyone want to guess what happened? The Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, remember the TARP, when everyone was in the White House and Bernanke and Paulson were scaring all the members of Congress into voting for these emergency provisions, included a provision to accelerate or move forward the date at which time the Fed can start paying these interest payments on reserves, and it went into effect immediately in 2008. Okay, it became right away the tool that the Fed used to prevent excess reserves from entering the economy. So there is an interest rate called the IOER rate. It has been consistently set above any competing short-term rate that the banks might find attractive to put their excess reserves into. And I think this chart probably illustrates pretty well how it worked. Remember, when you get interest payments from the Fed on your excess reserves, this is a zero maturity asset you're holding. It's not like a 30-year treasury bond. So the bank could choose to buy a treasury bond 10 years out, but they in theory have to wait 10 years until it matures, or they could try to sell it on the open market. They might take a loss if bonds move down or move against them. But this is zero maturity. You can cash out of your reserves anytime you want, and it's completely risk-free, right? It's safer than a treasury bond because the Fed just creates the money that it pays the interest to the banks on. So you can't get much safer than this if you're a bank. So if you look at this chart here, we're going all the way back to the financial crisis. This red line here, this is the IOER rate. This is the rate that the Fed has been paying to banks on those trillions of dollars in excess reserves. And if you look at competing assets that the banks could choose to put their money into instead, we have two dotted lines. The very, very dotted line is the it says the 4-week Treasury. I didn't even know the Treasury issued a 4-week. Okay, that's extremely short-term security. There is the dotted / dash line, which is the 3-month Treasury. And then the solid line, I'm not even sure why that's there. That's the 1-year Treasury. The point where you're talking about holding money for 1 year is I'm not sure that's really a good, it's a viable competitor to an IOER payment because you've got to, in theory, hold on to that security for as long as possibly a year. But does anyone notice the red IOER rate is consistently for years and years and years, all during the ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, all those years, it's higher than the 4-week and the 3-month Treasury rate. Okay. What effect does this have? Okay, it incentivizes banks not to use their excess reserves at a minimum to buy short-term treasuries, because if they buy a short-term treasury, the money enters the economy. So you're basically giving them an incentive to sit on those reserves, basically let them stay at the Fed and go nowhere. Sit on those reserves and collect that quarter point, which is what they got for most of the, I'll say the Obama years. Okay, and you'll notice as the Fed began its tightening, everyone remember the first interest rate hike was in late 2015. And then by sheer coincidence, 1 month after Trump won the 2016 election, the Fed announced 9 more rate hikes in the next 3 years. and we can see some of them starting here. You notice how the red IOER rate keeps stepping above the rising 4-week and 3-month Treasury rate. So the Fed is still trying to discourage the commercial banks from lending out those excess reserves, because the Fed understands that if those excess reserves begin to be lent out in large quantities, we are going to have, I don't know if I'd call it hyperinflationary, but we're going to have accelerating inflation if that starts to happen. Okay, the IOER, it's an effective tool, but it's difficult to defend politically. I don't know if any of you have been trying to figure out in your minds how much money the banks are making off of this. All right. So at the peak, I think it was in 2015, the monetary base was I can't remember the number, $4.1 trillion. But if you subtract out the cash component, the cash in circulation, and look at just what the excess reserves are, which again I got off the Federal Reserve site, the banks were holding $2.7 trillion in excess reserves. That's an enormous amount of money, and they were getting interest payments on it. Okay? But they were getting 0.25% interest, which is not a whole lot. So even on $2.7 trillion, annually the banks were receiving $6.7 billion for sitting on these reserves. Now that might sound like a big free lunch for them, but I cut out this Wall Street Journal article. In 2016, the U.S. commercial banking industry made $171 billion just on their traditional lending, and all the businesses that they conduct on a routine basis are far more profitable than the $6 billion they're getting in excess reserve interest payments. So at least for the 08, 09, all the way to 2016 period, it wasn't politically controversial. Of course, most people in the public didn't even know about it. It was people in Congress, like sitting on the House Financial Services Committee. That's the committee that Ron Paul used to chair, okay, and then he retired. I don't remember what year he retired, but knowledgeable members of that committee are the ones who were giving the Fed a hard time about paying interest on excess reserves. The problem with the politically indefensible part is what happens when rates start going up. They have been going up the last 2 years. So right now, I believe the last I checked, the IOER rate is 2.4%. Now, if you pay 2.4% on $2.7 trillion, that's a little bigger deal, right? The banks are getting $65 billion a year in risk-free interest payments from the Fed for sitting on those reserves. That is political hot water. And does anyone know the name Jeb Hensarling? Not a household name. Okay, he took over Ron Paul's chair. He's a Republican congressman from Texas. He was one of the most and he, by the way, he just retired, sadly, in January. He was one of the members who really knew monetary policy. Okay, a lot of the new members who go in there, they don't know anything. They're intimidated. They just defer to whatever the Fed chairman tells them to do. But kind of like Ron Paul, Hensarling knew, and he was very fiery, and he would challenge them. And he's been one of the biggest critics of this IOER policy for a long time. Interestingly enough, Maxine Waters, who I believe is the ranking Democrat, and now she's the chair of that committee. Okay, God help us, all right. But interestingly enough, in a strange moment, a rare moment of bipartisanship, when she was the minority ranking member, she teamed up with Hensarling, and they both grilled Janet Yellen and said, okay, you've got to reduce your balance sheet. You can't keep paying this much money out for free to the banks. And that's what this story is. Now, American Banker wanted me to sign up and create an account and pay, and I'm too cheap to do that. So I was only able to screenshot the headline and get the first paragraph. But as you can see, Republicans were ramping up their criticism of the Fed for making interest payments on excess reserves. It's going to be debated on Thursday. And last week, Jeb Hensarling from Texas told Janet Yellen that IOER should not, quote, not become a permanent tool of monetary policy. So there are some people in Congress who are trying to do about this, even though most of the public is unaware of IOER policy. So in response to that pressure, the Fed has been reducing its holding of assets. You guys hear headlines saying the Fed's reducing its balance sheet, winding down its balance sheet. You ever heard that? Okay, that means all those reserves that banks are holding, the Fed didn't give it to them for free. The Fed bought assets from the banks. It traditionally buys Treasury securities, and during the crisis, it bought a bunch of lousy mortgage paper, which was very controversial at the time too, and it's been holding on to them ever since. So the Fed is slowly selling off those assets, and when it sells it, the member banks that buy those assets back, they give the Fed those excess reserves back to the Fed where they're destroyed, And you look surprised.
It's just a loan then, right? It's not only a loan, it's a
pretty interesting loan.
It's a loan where they pay for giving.
Yeah, it's a pretty good loan. It's a loan where you get interest on it. Yeah, exactly. But no, this is actually how the Fed, minus the mortgage paper and minus the trillions of dollars, this is how the Fed has conducted open market operations for nearly ever since 1922. 1922 is when it was authorized to begin this process, and it's a policy tool. So. You probably heard it's winding down the balance sheet, and sure enough, it has. Now, again, this is not the whole base. It only goes up to 2.8 trillion. So you see, this is just excess reserves. This is what we care about in the base. And it peaked at almost, or somewhere around 2.7 trillion, 2.8 trillion. It's down as of 2 months ago to 1.6 trillion. And it's winding down its balance sheet because it's under pressure from Congress to stop paying out these absurd amounts of money, interest payments to banks. In my opinion, they could have started winding down their balance sheet years ago. The crisis was over 10 years ago. You could argue, okay, the Eurozone crisis happened in 2011, so a year or two later that stabilized. So maybe in 2013, let's start winding it down. But it's been holding on to these excess reserves all this time, and this is just my opinion. But I think it would have held them even longer if they could. But it's only started selling these assets back, because there are certain people in Congress and the oversight committees that are telling them you can't keep paying out this sort of interest. So we're now down to $1.57 trillion in excess reserves that the banks are earning 2.4% on. They're still getting $38 billion a year. So the Fed either has to keep reducing that balance sheet, or it needs to lower interest rates, and we know it's probably not going to lower interest rates anytime soon. If anything, it's the opposite. It tends to be raising interest rates, although they seem to have backed off after the scare that the market gave them around Christmas time.
I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
So how come the legislatures or Congress people have such a short memory span? From 2008, with the financial crisis meltdown, we gave the banks so much money to bail them out. Why wasn't that, with this, part of that discussion? Like, to package it in the same thing.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I followed you right up till the very last sentence. If I'm understanding the last sentence correctly, are you saying why didn't Congress remind them, hey, we bailed you out, now you need to start reducing your balance sheet? Yeah. And the answer is, for all I know, maybe they did. I have to admit, I haven't read the transcripts of every single hearing. But I would think, particularly some of the more anti-commercial bank members of these committees probably have told the Fed and if they ever bring commercial bank executives in front of them, they've probably told and reminded them, yeah, we bailed you out, and so forth. But that's also a political question. I'm not really quite as good with the politics as I am with the economics. And it's not like it's not like the Fed isn't responding. I mean, they have lowered. It stopped going up. It didn't sit at 2.7 trillion. They have reduced it. Now, some of that is due to the assets have matured. But a great deal of it also is they are actively, in their open market operations, selling these assets back to commercial banks.
Can they borrow against those assets?
The commercial banks?
Yes.
I don't believe so. That's a good question. But in fact, the more I think about it, the more I think the answer is definitely no. But when the talk's over, ask me again and give me another minute to think about it.
All right.
So, yeah. I did think about it. Yeah, no. When you borrow from the Fed, that's the discount window, which hasn't been used. It's usually used during crises, and the discount window has always been the same. You borrow from the Fed, but you have to have good collateral, and good collateral has usually been treasuries. So you, the bank, you have to hold. You shouldn't be selling treasuries to the Fed. You need to be holding treasuries if you want to get.
Borrowing from the Fed.
That's what I meant. Yeah, that is what I meant.
That bank now has an asset. As a bank, it doesn't have to just borrow from the Fed, right? I mean.
Oh, I see. Oh, you mean borrow from another bank?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the Fed funds rate. That's another operation. It's the same thing. The other bank has to be satisfied with here. But that other bank is loaded with excess reserves. So if that's the case, you're just going to transfer excess reserves from one bank to another.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And what are you borrowing it for? I mean, I don't know why you'd want to borrow it. You've got plenty of your own if you want to lend it out.
You're allowed to loan out.
Yeah, you're allowed to loan out anyway. Okay. Question.
Well, I was going to point out the other problem is the money goes away. If the loan matures and it goes back to the Fed, then the money ceases to exist.
That's
right.
If
the Fed sells the loan, then the bank had to give the money to the Fed in order to acquire the loan again. So the bank's balance sheet should not be.
Yeah, and I want to be precise with the vocabulary. They have to sell the reserves. I know reserves are money, but they're a very specific kind of money. So yes, when the Fed sells assets back, the bank pays for those assets by giving its reserves back to the Fed, which in turn destroys those reserves. Okay. When it matures, that's a little more complicated. I'm not 100% sure how that works. When it matures, it's the federal government. If it's a treasury, the federal government is the one paying off the treasury, and the Fed actually receives the payment from the federal government. Whether it's receiving in terms of reserves, which I hope it is, or whether it's receiving it just in the terms of like M1 type money is another matter. And this is a personal project of mine to research it, because some of you may know at the end of the year, if the Fed posts a profit of its own after it pays operating costs plus the dividend it pays to its member bank shareholders, any profits go right back into the treasury. So this could be a backhanded way of monetizing debt for free, but I don't want to get into that because I don't fully know how that mechanism works. I have a contact down at San Jose State who would know, but I've already bugged him enough this year. I'll probably check in with him a little bit later. Yeah. Okay, so we're getting near this QE subject. So we're now hearing, not as much, but we're hearing some of the same error made in reverse. Now that the Fed is unwinding the balance sheet, we're beginning to hear that there's going to be a massive deflation. You guys ever heard that in the news? Okay. In fact, the very first slide in my presentation, the intro, had this AFA Gold website saying, there is no known way to withdraw this excess liquidity from the system without engendering significant economic disruptions. I must not have included the rest of the web page, but they were saying when you start winding down this balance sheet, it's basically sucking money out, putting it back at the Fed and destroying it. It's going to create a major deflation. Well, maybe you can see how this isn't true either. It's the same error in reverse. It would be a deflation if those reserves had entered the economy into the M1 and M2, but they never got out of the Fed, or at least out of the accounts that the commercial banks have with the Fed in the first place. They were just sitting there idle. So reserves that were effectively what economists call sterilized, okay, are just now being removed with no impact whatsoever on the real economy. So we're not going to have some major deflationary, we haven't. They've already withdrawn $1 trillion worth of these reserves, and there hasn't been a major deflationary event. And, okay, Ben Bernanke, nice guy. I don't particularly like his policies, but he was absolutely right. In an interview in 2016, someone mentioned the hyperinflation predictions, and he said, very nicely, he said the media advanced a lot of uninformed views, and if you went back a few years and listened to the media and congressmen, they would say the Fed's asset purchases will cause hyperinflation, will cause the dollar to collapse, and none of that has happened. Because, to his credit, grudgingly, I will say to his credit, he knew. I mean, as soon as he started QE1, he knew he had to have a policy in place to prevent all of those excess reserves from creating a inflationary pressure, and he put it to work. Okay, yeah, that's actually, when I was building these slides, I was thinking the same thing, because he knew, right? Because he saw, because the critics saw this, that's what they saw, but they didn't understand interest on excess reserve policy. Okay, one more note, and this is a little bit unrelated about the QE, and this is an opinion of mine. This is just commentary on my part. This isn't IOER policy. We've all heard about the bailouts, the TARP. Remember how the banks all got the TARP was $750 billion. Of that, I think only quote unquote 410 or 415 billion of that was actually loaned to the banks, and the banks, for the most part, paid that back. The Treasuries made a profit on it. If they didn't pay it back in exchange for that, the Treasury held warrants which gave them the right to convert the debt into shares, and the U.S. government would become like a large stakeholder. That would be their compensation for the bank. And this is the big controversy. Everyone talks about the TARP bailout. But in my opinion, that's not the real bailout. Okay, the real bailout was the QE. The TARP was $400 billion plus, and it was a loan. The banks had to pay it back. The QE is the government purchasing these assets from the banks. It's not the Treasury holdings so much as it is the mortgage holdings. The banks, some of them were careless or reckless and made these loans or bought these securities. But as some of you in the room may know, many banks were forced by the federal government to make these lousy mortgage loans and to buy the lousy paper. So they're holding this paper, and then during the crisis, it plummets, right? A lot of these securities are trading at 30 cents on the dollar, and the Fed came in and bought them up for 100 cents on the dollar. Okay, so there's your first bailout. And then the banks start earning free interest, risk-free interest on those new reserves as well. And the quantity, I went on the Fed's balance sheet. So prior to the crisis, the Fed held $745 billion in treasuries and had absolutely no mortgage securities whatsoever. By 2015, which was the peak of the monetary base, the treasury holdings had increased enormously to $2.6 trillion, but the GSE, these mortgage-backed securities, and they must have been Fannie and Freddie-backed securities, had grown from zero to $1.8 trillion. So this is equivalent to a $1.8 trillion bailout. That is more than 4 times what the TARP is, and it's not even a loan that you have to pay back. Right? So it would be like an average Joe buying a house on speculation for $1 million, and it drops to $500,000, and the Fed says, no problem, here, I'll give you $1 million for it, and I'll let you earn risk-free interest on that $1 million while you're at it. To me, that was that was the true bailout, not the TARP. Okay, so the next subject is the global reserve dollar. Before we move on to that, anyone have any pressing questions about QE? Great. Okay, knowledgeable audience. All right. Okay, question?
So when they unload these mortgages, or if they still exist, what price are they forcing the banks to pay?
So there's no force. Okay, when they sell the securities, a bank can say no, I don't want them. Okay, that's a good question. I don't know what the mortgage securities, the ones that are left, are trading for. I suspect they're trading at a much higher price now than they did in the middle of the darkest hours of the crisis when everyone was scared to death. So if banks are buying those, I'm sure banks are buying treasuries, but if they're buying mortgage securities, they're probably paying a higher price than they went for at the time, but it's still a lower price, if you think about it, than the Fed paid them for it, right? The Fed paid 100 cents on the dollar. If the security is now trading at 90 cents on the dollar, if that's the agreement, then the banks could buy them back at technically less than they paid for them. But
is the idea that when the Fed was buying these assets, they couldn't just go on the open market and just buy them at the fair value, because then the banks would collapse. If that was a fair value, then banks have nothing.
If the Fed even did that, that's very unusual for the Fed to go outside of its own open market operations. It's the conference call they have with their member banks where they start buying assets. If they bypass that and go out into the economy and found grandma who's holding a mortgage-backed security, that would not only would that be very unusual, but it would defeat the whole purpose of QE. The whole purpose of QE, it was a bank bailout. The purpose of QE was to load the banks up with reserves so that they would not run out of reserves the way banks did during the Great Depression. You guys all know Ben Bernanke is a Great Depression scholar. Okay, so before he was Fed chair, he was head of economics department at Princeton, and most of his career was studying the monetary policy. Again, I'm gonna sound like I like him the way I'm talking about him here, but he really did study most of his career monetary policy mistakes of the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, the Fed would not engage in open market purchases. It's complicated. It has to do with a theory called the real bills doctrine. And the banks ran out of reserves and they failed. When you run out of reserves, you fail. So he loaded them up with these reserves to make sure they wouldn't run out and fail. And number two, to engender confidence in the public that it was safe for them to keep their money in the banks because the banks were so flush with reserves it could be converted to cash if the public decided they ever wanted to pull it out. So going to the secondary market would have completely defeated the purpose of the whole QE program. Okay. Yeah, one more.
What happens, so now that the banks are buying back, or the Feds are selling the assets like the treasuries and the mortgages, can the banks sell them and just end up with more cash or more reserves anyways? Or like, in these mortgages, aren't the banks now getting like paid back like the mortgage payments? So aren't they going to end up with more cash and more reserves anyway?
That's true, but banks can you don't need the Fed for banks to do that anyway. The banks can buy and sell effectively whatever asset they want on their own, even non-Fed member banks, and we do have banks that are not members of the Federal Reserve. They're free with the money they have to buy within regulatory requirements, safety requirements, whatever assets they want and to earn interest on them and to sell them later at a profit or to lose money on them if the securities should go down. So yes, they could buy these treasuries back from the Fed mortgage-backed securities from the Fed, earn interest on them, maybe even sell them a year later for a profit, but that's not any different from their normal business practice. The only difference is the Fed is the source of the asset instead of the secondary market. So there's nothing, I know you're not, I don't know if you're suggesting it's controversial, you're probably not, but there's nothing controversial about that. Okay, banks buy and sell treasuries all the time.